What's up guys, Ivan here with getivan.com, and in this video we're going to be looking at how to set up Stadio, which is a managed web UI for Stable Diffusion image generation. So I'm going to show you guys how to get started with Stadio, and then I'm going to show you some basics in terms of how I do things in Stable Diffusion. And hopefully this video won't go on too long. Go ahead and click the cog in the lower right hand corner and speed this video up to 1.5 so that you can get through it quickly. So when you go to make your account, help me out by using my link here, hi.getivan.com/Stadio. I'd really appreciate it. And if not, if that's offensive to thee, then no worries. So get to the site, start create a profile, and verify the account, etc., etc. And when you get to the back end, it'll look something like this. Pardon me. And what you have to do is you have to start your server. You don't need 2.1 support unless you want to use Stable Diffusion 2.1. There's a ton of models, but you have to, before you can start adding those, you have to go ahead and start the server, which I will do right now. And it'll take a while to do the initial startup. It's spinning up a pod or whatever. And once it's done, you can start and stop to turn the pod on and off. And if there's a problem with your pod, like it's glitchy for some reason, then you can utterly terminate the pod. And when you restart, it'll spin up a new pod. So while that's starting, you can head over to this Models tab. And there are a ton of Stable Diffusion models to choose from. Pardon me. So you can scroll through these. There's a lot of talk online about Midjourney, and there's all these guys who are saying Midjourney is so much better than Stable Diffusion, blah blah blah, and it's really just ignorant. If you look through some of these models, there are some quality outputs from Stable Diffusion models that are pretty much the same, in some cases possibly better than what you're seeing out there from Midjourney, from people posting Midjourney samples. There's an Elden Ring model, and excuse me, a lot of these are really pretty rich, pretty high quality. So you can take the time to look through some of these. This is the kind of style that I've seen a lot of high quality Midjourney posts for, and they're saying that they use waifu version diffusion. I mean, I thought it was Stable Diffusion 1.4, but the base at the moment for Stable Diffusion I think is about 1.5, and they might have a stable version of 2.0, but I think 2.1 might be the latest. I'm not sure. I haven't really kept up with it because I mainly use the synthwave punk model. But when you decide the models you want to try, you click these hearts to favorite them into your profile. Pardon me. And when you go to your account, you can go to the models section and refresh the page once the pod is loaded, and you'll see these loaded, not loaded things, and you basically just click those and it'll load it up into the instance. Now you want to make sure that it's loaded and ready to go before you start the pod, otherwise it can glitch a little bit. Pardon me. So you'll probably want to refresh the page and then go up into Connect here, and I like to open it in another tab. Let me see. So I think this is a new instance. So yeah, let me double check. So on every new pod that I start up, I always go to settings, and you definitely want to do this. Go to live previews and turn that off. Show live previews of the created image. Turn that off. Apply settings. And then up here in the Stable Diffusion checkpoint, you probably want to click the refresh button here, and then you can or you can click down here to reload the UI, and then click this drop down and select the specific model that you want to use. And if there's any glitches, like it flickers or it doesn't fully load, then you probably want to terminate your instance. You can try stopping the server, then restarting it and reconnecting to see if that works. But if it still glitches, then you probably did something in the midst of it trying to set things up which caused it to glitch. So just go ahead and terminate, then start a new pod and reconnect and go through the whole process. You want to load your models. you want to load your model before you connect, because if you're connecting while it's loading it, sometimes it can be a little finicky. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. So once you turn off the live previews, that will dramatically lower the processing time for all the stuff you're doing. And you're pretty much ready to go. You just have to configure your settings. So that's all there is to getting started with Stadio. It's really simple. It's really cost-effective pricing. You can create way more images at scale with Stable Diffusion than you can with Midjourney. Midjourney is way more expensive. And people like to talk about, oh, Midjourney is so much more trained and blah, 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 blah. Well, you've seen some of the models. There are a ton of high-quality models for Stable Diffusion. You can create way more images at scale. You can test and vet your prompts, in a much more fine-tuned manner. So the quality of the images that you can create, I would argue, on Stable Diffusion can be a lot greater than what is well, I don't know if I'd say what's common out there for Midjourney. It's a lot easier for people to plug and play in Midjourney, but I think that if you really want to refine things, like Stable Diffusion is the only way to go, because you just don't get that many credits with Midjourney. And with Stable Diffusion, you're paying for time through a service like this. So it's really just about, as long as you're working on it and going through the process, like, it's just a matter of putting in the hours to refine the image. So it does, disclaimer, it does take many hours to refine a prompt, but at the end of that, you should be able to get to a pretty high quality image. So a quick note here, under extensions, if you go to available, you can click this load from. It's already preloaded in the interface. And there are also a very large number of extensions for Stable Diffusion that do all kinds of interesting things. So you can take a long look at this list. There's a lot. The ones I've tested a few or several, and the one that has really caught my, I have a lot of things to test still, and keep in mind, I've been doing this stuff since probably October or November of 2022, and I think this stuff hit the web in August of 2022. I believe, I could be mistaken, but so I've been right here with it. I've used a variety of web UI, pardon me, and spent a pretty good number of hours testing things and vetting varieties of permutations for samplers and things like that. So I've done a pretty good amount, but there's a lot to test still. I mean, you can spend all your time going through this stuff. So something to keep in mind. The one that I have was really caught my attention, though, is Diffusion, which is basically an animation utility. And what it does is it just rapidly creates a large number of frames and then, kind of blends them together to try to create an animation. And I've come real close to creating sort of seamless, lively animations, but you have to tinker with it. I haven't used it in a couple months because I've been really more focused on just image generation. But at some point, I'll turn back around and use that. And I'll talk about that a little bit here. So if all you were interested in is how to set up Stadio and get going, then you've learned what you need to learn. But if you want to learn some of my Stable Diffusion tips, and stick around, I'll show you some things that I've been able to use to get some high quality outputs. Pardon me. So let's go into, so there are three areas that I mainly use, which obviously are the text to image section, the image to image, and this is really where I spend a lot of time, image to image. Sometimes the in painting, because you can actually go in and correct aberrations using the in painting, which is pretty cool. And then in this section under the scripts, I use the XYZ plot and also the loopback feature quite a bit. So there's a lot to do just in these two tabs, and in this one in particular. And then under extras, you can upscale images, and my recommended upscaler is the Swin IR 4X. So this lets you get 4K plus quality images pretty quickly using this extra feature. And there's also a batch processing utility. So those are the three main areas I use. Now, yesterday I did a first take on this video that was over 3 hours long, where I vetted out this prompt for a picture of a Maine Coon cat that was just sitting in a garden, resting. And which kind of sounds silly, it's totally random, just pulled that out of a hat basically. And so I want to show you some of the progress that I made in that period of time, but I don't want to take up all of your time in showing you guys that. So here's where we started. This is the previous instance I was working in. And this is the prompt that I developed during that time. Now, I'm not giving you my exact prompts for how I do some of my more serious projects because it's a little bit more proprietary. I've put, hundreds, if not, well, certainly hundreds of hours into creating some of those things. And so I don't necessarily want to give those away. But this is a general idea of the kind of prompt you'd be looking at doing. So let me blow this up a little bit so that you can see this a little easier. So the way that I approach this is, and there's a long story to this, but in short, what I've found is best is to place I call it the principal prompt into one long descriptive sentence. I've tried commas, I've tried, different ways of arranging, but really the long descriptive sentence works really well. For most images, a double emphasis, the parentheses will emphasize that, text that you're wrapping. And oftentimes double emphasis does really well, but in this case, actually, single emphasis is what seemed to do well. So single or double emphasis does well. And I've found that you almost always want to do single or double emphasis on the principal prompt, which is the primary thing that you're trying to get the software to develop. Everything else is highly secondary. Let me open up. Let me see here. So there's a site called Prompt Hero, I think is what it's called, for stable diffusion prompts. And as you'll see from this prompt I'm giving you, a neat little trick I recommend for everything that you do is include 4K, 8K in there. Relative. It depends on the style, but I include those in everything I do. I've done extensive testing between Unreal Engine and 8K and 4K and a variety of other descriptors. And there's something magical about just combining 8K and 4K. So I highly recommend including that. That's a free giveaway there. And you'll see this in people's prompts, but it's hard to tell which one of those is effective. People load up their prompts with so much junk, it's very difficult to tell what is doing what, And after a lot of testing that I've done, I've had periods where I've loaded the prompt and I've tried different settings in terms of the sampling steps, and I've thoroughly tested all of the samplers except for UniPC. This is a pretty new one. I need to test this one at some point, but I've tested them all very thoroughly and done a lot of XY plotting and gone between sampler steps and CFG scale. And I've come down here. Here are my base recommendations. Euler A is the best overall, most consistent overall. Now the minimum would be about, I'd say something like 7 sampling steps to 7 CFG. That's like the bare minimum. The minimum of, in terms of quality, would be 12 to 7, 12 sampling steps to 7 CFG. And then what I prefer to run is 150 sampling steps at 12 CFG. I've done a lot of testing, and this seems to be able to produce really high quality, rich 4K resolution type of images. So that comes with some, addendums and if this, then that sort of things. But that's a pretty rough guideline that I use. And for every prompt, I use 2 artists, and I put them like this. In this case, I literally did a search for famous digital painters or whatever, and I found some weird ones for Butcher Billy and Marija Tyrina. And so they're kind of unusual styles, but I included those 2 folks. And this is the output that it gave me, the first output. And I guess it was, what was it? I think I had this done really low at 12.7 is where it was at. And that's a good way to start developing an image is to look at the lower outputs, because if you can get things looking decent at the lower outputs, then as you loop back onto itself, as you begin to develop it in steps, then the final yields can be extremely rich, and I'm not quite there yet, but we'll show you where we landed in a moment. And before we get to that, let me explain one of the reasons I structure the prompts this way. So if we look at something like Prompt Hero and pick a random image like this turkey eagle or whatever this, I don't know what this is. So this one is done in Midjourney. It's a nice image. Let's find one done in Stable Diffusion. Let's click on Stable Diffusion. And this is also a good way, guys. Like if you just look through Midjourney to Stable Diffusion, and I'm mentioning this because there's such like a weird thought process on Stable Diffusion versus Midjourney. If you look at the tab for Stable Diffusion, the outputs that folks are doing are of comparable quality, if not better in some cases. But if we look at something like this, for example, so that one's 150 steps with 9 CFG, which is pretty good, and it's a pretty nice looking image. There's actually a lot of flat space, and there's a lot of text. So if we continue looking, a lot of the prompts that you'll find this is kind of the point that I'm attempting to make here. Here's a good example: 60 steps with 9 CFG, and a very large number of text in the prompt section and then the negative term section. So this is a very common, like I would suspect that if you were to look all over the place at different prompts, most guys are doing things this way. And my argument is that in large, it's a mistake in terms of generating the highest quality images. And that's based on a lot of experience testing and vetting these prompts at scale, particularly if you use something like the XYZ plot, then you can, oh, yeah, sorry, this server's crashed. We got to use this one. Using the XYZ plot, you can do variables for steps and for CFG and samplers and things like that. And I've done enough of that at scale it doesn't take that long necessarily, but as long as you have a viable prompt. But if you do the testing, you will find that it's true. More steps does add a lot more detail to your image. And the problem is that some guys have this idea that it doesn't take that many steps to create a quality image, and that's true to some degree. This is a quality image. But, pardon me, the fewer the number of steps, if you put your tests on a range, you will find that the lower number of steps is more surreal. It's more blurred and smeared paints, right? The higher number of steps, it's a lot more lines. It's a lot more detailed. There's a lot more, that's gone into creating the image. So one of the issues is that when guys crank up their processes to a higher number of steps and they have all these terms, it does what I call cooking the image or making it crispy, where the saturation goes overboard, the lines go overboard, and it just becomes gnarly. And the reason that happens, it's a combination of what you're doing with the steps and the CFG, and in some cases the denoising factor, which is an image-to-image variable. And but it's also has to do with that in conjunction with the descriptive qualities of your prompt. So if you're running a low step prompt and you have a ton of text, oftentimes what this is doing, how they're able to achieve this is they're they're getting a low number of steps, and in certain areas of the image, they're able to achieve higher quality because they are loading the prompt with tons of words. And so what happens, they have a ton of words, right? And then they increase those steps and it cooks the image, right? It takes those words and it dials all of those criteria up. And that's the reason that guys can't get higher quality images oftentimes, because they are using too many words and then they are trying to increase the detail. And the problem is they're kind of cheating with the prompt here, offloading, quality into the words instead of into the steps. So hopefully you follow what I'm saying. That's why you want to keep your prompt as short and simple as possible, so that when you increase in the number of steps, it doesn't overcook the image. It actually takes the small number of things you're describing there and it ramps up the quality into those areas. Pardon me. So that is a much better approach to doing things. I've made neat images using both methods, and there's really kind of one excuse to use this approach would be animations, but it's kind of, I would still lean away from doing a ton of words, and I would probably lean further into increasing the emphasis and lowering the steps if I was doing animation. The reason you want to lower a steps in an animation is because it allows you to create a lot more, it allows you to create images a lot more rapidly. So when you create a ton of frames, you can ideally get a more seamless action. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but I'm just saying keep the prompt short and sweet and increase or decrease the emphasis. And then a lot of what I do is I adjust the words at a low scale to figure out what I really want. And then when I find an image of something I like, I take that and I refeed it into itself, and I work with it in steps until the image is really high quality. So here's a kind of crude example. This is what I worked on yesterday for like a few hours. I settled on this prompt, which is really silly: resting Maine Coon cats in a paradise garden with rainbows. So I put no more than 60 seconds or whatever into that prompt, right? And some of the outputs are just, ridiculous, kind of weird styles, as you can see here. But I decided to go with 12 steps and 7 CFG in this instance, and just find something that had the smallest number of aberrations with the most interesting style. And I chose this particular image. Just a very simple resting cat, right? Now, for a lot of guys, they're like I've been describing, they don't grasp that this is not a process. This is not a thing where you can throw in your prompt and expect to get everything done for you. Like, you've got to be willing to look at the potential of the image, right? So I was able to take this in a few hours and tweak and tweak and tweak this image until I got it to this point here. Let me show you this in the image to image section. So keep this in mind. We went from here with the squiggly lines and the messed up eyes and the splotchy paint, and we worked it up to this point. So that's getting a lot closer to where it needs to be, but we can go even further. We can continue, working into the details and upscaling the quality. And if you compare those side by side, let me see if I can save this image. I think I already saved it. Let's go here. Let me save. Let me save this like this. And let me just open this so that we can look at this side by side so that you guys can really see the difference in quality. So it's the same general image, but obviously you can see we have a lot more lines. We have a lot more color variations. It's a lot more saturated, better contrast. We have better tech. We even have textures and like spackling in the image. We even have a little bit of depth into the stone here. It's been articulated a pretty good deal. The face, the eyes are a lot cleaner. It's a better image, and it's worked in steps and steps and steps and steps, right? That's what you have to do. You can take something crude and you can work it up in steps. Now, this is not perfect, but it's close to where I'd like it to be. But we kind of have to transplant some of this stuff over into our other environment, so that because this is my previous pod, so that we can work on some of this. So let's look at the text to image section, just so I can show you guys kind of what I was doing. I also will often run negative prompts just to make sure that certain things don't appear, and often with double emphasis. And sometimes if things don't turn out well, you might want to turn that down as well, but usually 1 to 2 emphasis. Always do 500 pixels until it's ready to go, and then I upscale it. But let's take a look at. I want to show you guys. Let's see, not the prompt matrix. So the prompts from file or text box, for those of you who are interested in SEO. Once you get to a place where your prompt is really solid and it can generate a high quality image by itself, then you can use prompts from file or text box. And sometimes you can do that from in order to be able to do that from the text to image section, your prompt has to be pristine. And that's actually a lot harder to do. That takes many hours to make a pristine prompt that generates a random image at absolute highest quality. But the only way to do that is to adjust the words in the principal prompt. Okay, so keep that in mind, the words, and in some cases, maybe the CFG, but it's primarily the words, in the principal prompt. So the rest of your descriptors, they don't necessarily need to change. It's the primary words. Okay. But in the image to image section, that'd be mainly where you'd want to be doing the prompts from file or text box, using an image as a seed, like this one here. Or sorry, not that one. Shoot. I wonder how I saved this. I got to make sure that I don't lose this. Let me put this as zeros. Okay. There's a ton of images I saved there on the way to scaling up to that particular image. So when you're working from a root image like this, you can then use the prompts, and then you can have it do very subtle changes at scale. So if you're doing if you do like a niche site or a sub niche type of site, and it's all on one particular kind of product, like in this example I was using, I was saying if you did a pet site for Maine Coon cats, right? And you did pet products for Maine Coon cats, like very sub niche type of site that you could do with this example. And then you could just do subtle variations on that seed image that you're doing using keywords, right? And so that's a place where you can use the prompts from file or text box. You have to look up the format, and it's something like dash prompt, and then in quotes you have to do your prompts like this, line by line. But it's cool because you can generate a large quantity of images that way. And if your seed image and your prompt articulators or whatever are really well vetted, then you can get predictable results at scale. Now it takes a lot of work to do that, right? But the good news is if you spend a day, or maybe pay someone to spend a day or something to work that out, then you could generate images of quality at scale. You could generate animations, even using this kind of method. So it's pretty neat. Anywho, That'd mainly be where I'd use that. But in some cases, if your prompt is really solid, you can use the prompt from file or text box utility, which I sometimes use. Now, the XYZ plot thing is really kind of where it's at. So in this case, let me give you an example. Let me say 7 steps, 12 to 50 to 150. And then for CFG, we'll go, let's do 7 at minimum, and then 12, and then 15, just to show you kind of what to expect here. If you get above 15, it really tends to cook things. So something to think about. There was a period where I used 17 pretty frequently, and then a lower number of steps. And that lets you, not take very long in the processing time because of the steps, but then it hyper contrasts the colors and the details. So that's one way to go, and that might be a way to do it for animations. But overall, I still prefer 150 to 12. So we'll have it do a legend and include the sub images here, and we'll have it do a batch of 2. So let's hit the go button here, just so you guys can see in a grid how this stuff populates. And actually, I forgot to do a warm up process so that it would go faster. Let's skip ahead. Okay, let's take a look at the grid image, and then we'll look at some of these here. Let me download this because there's an issue with blowing up the preview right now. So this feature, obviously, you guys have probably seen this in other places. It saves so much time when you want to be able to see exactly the right sort of Goldilocks zone where things are not cooked maybe so intensely. But you can see down here at 7 and 7 or 7 and 12 that there's a pretty good level of surrealism. The lower the number of steps, right? And you can see the CFG just nukes it way too hard. Like you have to have that in steps in order for that contrast to be applied, apparently. But we go from the top left to the bottom right, and it goes from surreal and low contrast and very pastel oriented colors, right? And then it gets real hyper realistic, a high level of contrast and detail. We can see there at 50 and 15, there's a pretty good image right there. So that's a pretty good yield. But we go over to the bottom right, and we can see that it gets more complicated in the environment there. That one's pretty good too. But overall, the increased number of steps always adds a lot more detail. It's sometimes a bit difficult to tell, though. And so one of the angles that I take when I'm creating the prompts is to make sure that in the principal image, we're doing a principal object, right? And then we're also doing that object in a landscape. And we're describing characteristics of the object, and we're describing some characteristics of the landscape. And so when you look at 50, for example, it does pretty well at the principal object, but it really cuts the landscape short. You see how they're flat colors. Anytime you have flat colors, gradients, smooth surfaces, the object in the foreground might appear to have more detail, but the image as a whole is significantly less complex than when you look over here at 150. And so you can clearly see here that these cats there's more granular details in their hairs. You see how their hairs are standing up. They're a little fuzzier. And a lot of patterns here, gradients in the colors of the fur. But then in the environment's a lot more complex. There's flowers. There's a lot of going on with the rainbows in the sky. So, and you can see that there also for 150. So obviously this looks fugly. So if you wanted it to output just from the get-go really well, you'd really have to work in those words. But that's really not the goal. The goal is to find a base image and then you feed it into the image to image section, and you work it up step by step until it gets to a point where it's, it's usable and looking attractive. And you can keep that going, for a pretty good while, you know. So let's pick up where I left off, and then I'll let you guys go. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I want to actually do some of this on screen, a little bit more of this on screen, so you can see a little more of how I do things. Let's grab the prompt over here, and we put it over here. And same thing for the negative prompt. And here on the sampler, let's turn this up to 150. Now you can spend a ton of time messing with the denoiser. So the denoiser, if it's at 0, the image won't change at all. If it's at 1, it'll be a completely different image. So oftentimes what I found a good range is about 0.2 to 0.5. When you get above 0.5, like if you get up to 0.7, it'll significantly change the image. So 0.2 to 0.5 is a good place where you can see significant change. And in this particular instance, I found that leaving the CFG at 7 made it so that we didn't get too much cooking on the lines, so that the lines weren't too saturated. And so that's what allowed us to get to this level of result from where we started. Let's go into the XY plot though, because I want to show you guys some of the differences in the XY plotting. Let's go to, or for denoising, including the denoiser in those processes. So let's not mess with the steps. I want to stick at 150 in this case, but let's go nothing on the steps. And then CFG, we'll put this as, pardon me, we will put this at 7 and 12, just because I want to show you guys the difference. And then for denoising, let's do this at 0.2. Let's go 0.2. And do we want to do 3, 4, 5, or just do 4 and 5? Let's do 3, 4, 5, because it'll give you an opportunity to see the range. Yeah, and 0.1 is also useful if you want there to be just a very tiny amount of flux. I think that's probably going to come in handy with animations when you want things to look real lively, because you can process this stuff at 150 steps in the prompt, but when you do it at a low denoising strength, it processes super rapidly, because it only needs to change a very tiny, 10% of the image. So once you create the principal image, then what you can do with those variations and permutations is pretty exciting, Pardon me, let me include the sub images there. And let's go ahead and do 2 in the batch. That'll be good. And hit the go button. Now, right now we're just doing the plot. So we'll get to the loop back feature in a moment. And let's skip ahead to the result. Okay, let's take a look at the grid here. And let me just go ahead and save this so we can look at it zoomed in a little bit. Let's blow this up. So here's 0.2 with 7 and 12. Now, when we're taking a look at this from a distance, let's look at the 7. And you can see from here to here, from a distance, there's more coloring here, isn't there? And certainly down here at CFG 12, we can see the same thing and a little bit more contrast, right? Take a look at the stone in this section, and then look at the stone over here. There's more shadows. There's more sheen. There's more wood detail. You see that? There's a little bit more lighting and dynamics in the grass blades there also. Let's zoom in. So one thing I look for is what I call cooking, which is where things have become crunchy. And so you see how it's a little pixelated and crunchy there, pixelated in the rainbow, very much so on CFG 12. On this one, we can see lines around the fur. So that's where it's too crunchy. It's cooked a little bit too much. That's at denoising 0.2. So at denoising 0.3, it might be a tad better. It's a little too crunchy there for sure. Let's look at 0.4. Definitely too crunchy. This guy has a conjoined twin. That's way too crunchy. This one's not as bad. And then here's 5. So on 5, we've got some neat coloring and contrast and details, but the problem is it's becoming a little fugly, right? And so if we were to look at this one and we were to zoom in similarly here, if we were to compare it like this, you see this is less developed, but it's smoother. And that's what we want to see. And if we kick this up down to the final level, now that one might debatably be better. So the goal here is, when we're running different tests, is to identify ones that are one step better and to use those as new bases, right? And to just keep developing the base. Doing it from the prompt level, from a completely random image generation, is very, it's a tedious process to try to do it like that. So this is the power of Stable Diffusion. And I think a lot of guys, they expect to put in a prompt and to just it magically be exactly what they want. It's a process. I don't think it's very reasonable to assume that you're just going to land on exactly what you need. But if you treat it like a process, you can get whatever you're going for if you work on the image. So this one is 12. Let's compare those. 12 has some merit, but actually I'd say it's a little bit too saturated. It's a little bit too exposed. So that's, I think, why 7 is a little bit more mild. And actually, given the slight amount of cooking, I like some of the details in this one, but it also kind of makes me think, it makes me wonder if that's too, because that one's really clean. We want a clean face, but there are a lot of great features here. And so from there, I might go, okay, 150 on 7 seems to have done really well, right? Or sorry, yeah, 150 on 7 at 0.5, right? That's 0.5 denoising. And so maybe if we change the CFG value to a lower point so that it can continue turning over, then we might see something interesting here. So let's try 3. Do we want to do 3? I think 3 might be too low. 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's try 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. And then we'll stick with 0.5 here. I think that's good. And we'll run this again, just out of curiosity, just to see what we can get. Let's skip ahead to these results. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. Let me save this. So, denoising 5 with CFG up to 7. Let's see if we can tell. There's 4. There's 7. Let's zoom in. It's a little bit crunchy. Might be negligible. That one's a little bit more, a little bit messier. Actually, all of those are pretty high quality cats. So we got denoising 5 at CFG. Oh, here we go. Here's 4. Here's 7. 4, 7. 4, 7. Yeah, 7 definitely has better coloring, and some of the, well, it is a little bit rich, isn't it? Maybe 5. There's 6. There's 7. 4 might be good in terms of feeding back into itself. 5 is actually pretty good. And it's definitely a bit more detailed. You can see the bricks, better colors, great face, great details. So then I would decide here, what's a CFG I want to do. 4 might be okay. 7 might be a little bit too strong. And the reason is because we're going to loop back into itself, you know. So let's try 5, a CFG of 5. And we'll turn off the plot utility. And then we'll just come up here and do a batch of 6. And here we need to make sure the denoising is set at 5. And then we can generate this to give us a little bit more, give us some more options in terms of what we want to replace our seed with here. It's sometimes the progress bar hangs up a bit and this grays out, but when it returns to full color, that's when it's finished processing. And then sometimes the grid can take a minute to populate. It's something to keep in mind. In a minute here, I'll show you guys the loopback script. Unfortunately, there's not enough bulk features for that thing, but it's really awesome. Like, it depends on what you're using it for, but what the loopback script does is it'll take an image and generate it based on your criteria, and it'll just immediately feed it back into that process an X number of times that you want to do it. So if you're confident that blind resubmission can work really well, then it will do well for you. We got some, looks like we got some great outputs here. Oh, that's weak. That's interesting. These are not as high quality as some of the stuff we saw a second ago, because you see it's a little bit fuzzier. We're losing a little bit of detail. And we want to increase in detail. Now that's a good one. Let me save that one. It might be an excuse to kick it back up to 7, yeah, because that's kind of weak there. Let's kick it back up to 7. You can tell though, like we're getting it to a bit of a, one level up higher, right? Okay, so let's kick it back up to 7 and rerun this process, and then I'll show you guys the loopback feature. Okie dokie, let's take a look at some of these. Looks promising from a distance. Oh, that's fugly. Yeah, that's a little bit wonky there too. Yeah, that's no good. And that's weak. That's weak. Yeah, that's weak too. That's interesting. We got more aberrations that time. Let's try kicking it back down to, it could be 5 or maybe 6. But let's go ahead and do a loop back test so that I can show you guys how that works. Now, I've found that two loops at a denoising of 5 works pretty well for a lot of different things. Sometimes I'll go up to 4, maybe do 4 and 0.4. When you go higher than that, it frequently cooks it. You really have to run it in steps. So in this case, let's just go ahead and test these features with a 5 CFG, because the lower CFG actually might be good for increasing the quality, you know, and these here I wouldn't worry about those. You can just leave those at linear. Let's drop the batch count though. They changed the way that this works recently, so you don't really want to have batch count because what it'll do is it'll do 2 loops and then that's one in the batch, and then if you have like 6 batch in there, it'll do basically, you know, 12 sessions that serve 6 images. It's a long story, but the batches are very powerful. So it really, the loop back for higher loops might work well if you're running really low settings, like, you know, 7 steps and 7 CFG or something, or, you know, 12 steps, 7 CFG, you know, low steps, low CFG, and then you want to cook whing, really fast. That's what the loop back is really good for. Pardon me. So let's try this 2 to 5 here at a 5 CFG. And while that is loading, let me go ahead and show you guys real quick. I segmented some images to show you guys that I've done for some other projects that were not, in some case, some of these are not fully deployed, but I wanted to show you what I've been able to create just so you can see that I have created some other high quality pieces. So this is obviously clouds, and there's a lot of detail in the lighting and these nice little curly features. And so this is one of my one of the pieces I really like a lot. A lot of great colors. And here's another, or wait a second. Oh, this is my clouds folder. This is another nice cloud image. Let me close this one and show you. Let's see, here's another nice cloud image. A lot of nice curlies there. So that's another good one. And then here's probably my, you know, big boss image, the one of the best images I've ever done. And I've shared this several times with some folks on different places, but you can see the water is really wild, and it just has a lot going on with lighting and details. So that's a super high quality image I've done. So that's a really good one. Here's another one of a thorny type of plant. And that one was, believe it or not, this one took me, probably took me like 17 hours or something like this prompt, because this particular one, I was populating these from the text to image prompt. So that was one where I really put a lot of time into the words so that it could generate it perfectly just from the get-go. And I did not do image stepping. So if I threw this into the image stepping process, I could probably improve it. But you can see there's a lot of details in this kind of image. And I have one more similar one like that, cactus type variation, which has a lot going on. Pardon me. Great deal of detail in the lighting there. Let's see. And then there's some unusual ones that I tried to do with stained glass. I thought they were pretty, but getting the objects to arrange properly with stained glass ideas at the time I was working on it was a bit unusual. But the patterns I thought were pretty neat in terms of their quality. And then this is a similar, that was a similar process. And this, I think in this one I might have used the Elden Ring model, but you can see there's some great textures and qualities here. This is a low resolution image, but you get the idea. So those are some examples of some things I've done really high quality besides goofy, colorful cats, you know. But it's the same process. That's kind of what I wanted to drive. So these faces are no good. So the loop back feature failed in this instance, but let's run it though. I just want to show you guys like how wild it can get if we create a range. Like, let's create a range of say 6, and let's go. We could do 0.4. We could do 0.2. Let's go ahead and try 0.4 with 6 steps, and let's skip ahead. Okay, let's take a look at some of these crunchy cats. So let me download this range so that you guys can look at it a little bit closer. So you can kind of see the process here where it starts really bleeding the image out, which is interesting. Oftentimes it gets pretty crunchy, and this is probably the reason this happened is probably because we altered the CFG to be so much lower. So since the CFG is so much lower, every iteration it actually bleeds out the image a little bit. So in a way, when you're processing the image, you can either turn up certain features, and technically you can tone them down a little bit. So you can turn them up, tone it down, turn it up, tone it down, turn it up, tone it down, and that it you would expect it to be linear, but it's really not linear. It always works based on the state of where the image is in that moment. And as you can see, there's a pretty good example of how that's happening. So just for the sake of seeing what happens, let's crank this up to 12, and you'll see it probably cook a little bit. Let's go ahead and process this one. Hey, here we go. We can kind of see at a distance we're getting a lot more detail there. So let's take a look at some of these cats. That's not too bad, but the problem is the face. The face is getting cooked a little bit too much. Yeah. There's some nice detail around here in the environment, but then it's just that face. So that's way too crunchy there. That's too much. That's too much. That's too much. But we can see, like, look at the paws there. The paws are really starting to shape up in that particular image. So what we want to do is figure out what is the range. And it looks like at the third step or so, we might be seeing a great deal higher quality. So, I mean, that's pretty similar, 2 to 3 steps. And we just got to figure out what the CFG value might be so that we can get that quality without cooking that face too hard. We could, try to mess with the face with in paint and stuff like that. That just wastes time, really. You want the image to alter all at once, pretty much. So let me think here. If we did 2 steps, it could be denoising variability. Let's try doing this at 0.2, and let me think here. Let's rerun it at 6 just to see what. And now we're at 12 CFG. It might be good to turn it down. It might be good to just turn the CFG down and rerun that same process. So 7 to 12. Let's try this at 9. And generate. And this really took a wild turn. Now all of a sudden we're in like vector world here. All we changed was the CFG scale, and it really dramatically changed the output quality. That's almost better, maybe. Yeah, it really started to go backwards. So we definitely do not want to go backwards. But if we turn the CFG up higher than 12, it's just going to cook too much. So maybe let's try this at 4 and 2. Let's try that real quick. We could run an XY plot again just to sort of see a range at the first step, but last time we ran it, it showed that 5, right? It was 0.5 denoising that was ideal at the first step. Let's take a look at some of these. it's just slightly cooked too much. That's too much also. Too much. That's way too much. And what must be doing that there is just that it's got to be the 12 CFG. We can't go to, I don't think we could go to 1. It would basically do the same kind of thing. Well, anyways, let's turn this off for now and run a batch, and then we'll call this because I don't want to take up too much of y'all's time. I bet we could get a good result just at 5 here with a batch of 6, and then I can step it up one at a time. That's another way to do it. Trying to think if I wanted to test any of the denoise. Now, last time we got good yield from that process. Let's do this again. Now, once you have an image, you can basically take it over to the extra section, drop it in here like so, resize by 4-ish. You can scale it to a specific dimension, but I wouldn't recommend doing that unless really the best place to do this in terms of a specific dimension is right here. And what's cool is if you change the aspect ratio, it'll fill in the rest of the image to match based on the prompt. So it works really well. So you don't have to go through a whole lot of trouble, But once you get what you like, upscaler to Swin R4. That's there might be a new one, a couple of new ones. I think I've tested some of I don't know if I've tested all of the other ones, but I did some research on it and I tested some of them, and then Swin R really works well. So that's the one I use. And then you just hit the go button and it outputs a higher resolution image. So you get better details when it's blown up, obviously. Let's take a look. So that's way too saturated, too much, too much, too much. That one's not bad, but the face. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to come to a conclusion on the Maine Coon cat, but hopefully I'll get that figured out and post it as the thumbnail of the video or something like that so you guys can see it. But thanks for watching. You get the idea. Don't forget to check out my link here, hi.getivan.com/Stadio. If you want to get started on Stadio, I find it addictive. Get some music going and sit here and tweak and tweak and tweak an image, and eventually, I'll be able to get this to a pretty good level of quality. Who knows if I'll have anything useful to do with it, but thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you later. Bye-bye.